So I was watching your video about angels and gods that you had made, I think, about 2 weeks ago. And I thought that that was a really interesting topic that I've had an interest in, and that, like you said in the beginning of that video, people don't really think about very much, or if they do think about, they have sort of like that John Milton, like hyper fictionalized version of what that all is.
Yep.
So maybe you could give like just a summary of like what your argument was in that video for people who are listening.
Yeah, I mean, this is it's become like a recent passion of mine, because one of the biggest things I think is wrong with the church in the West is our loss of the spiritual worldview. So like we want to go to church and those kind of things to feel good, but we don't want to admit that there's a spiritual war going on around all of us, and that these supernatural things exist, and these beings exist, and we kind of just ignore that. We don't want to talk about it. It's complicated. The pastor a lot of the times doesn't want to bring it up too much and talk about it. Good ones will, but I think it's a problem in the overarching church, and so that's just been a passion of mine. And so yeah, one of the more recent things that I've been working through is some scholarly literature on that sort of stuff, which is just the idea of like we have this view, and it is, I mean, Paradise Lost is a lot of it, and then that seeped into the Catholic Church and the Puritans and like the early church that would have influenced kind of our modern view of we have like winged people, or you have like the cathedrals with the babies with wings, and like that's what we think angels and demons are, is just like babies with wings who fly around and they give you messages. And there was a battle at the beginning of time, and they all got cast out, and now they're all demons, and that's just like not biblical. Like if you look through the Bible, you are not going to find a story anywhere that tells you that. And so that was one of the things I always was like, where are we getting this information from? It comes, I mean, Milton he gets hit with a lot of it, but there's other suggestions of that. People like Dante give us ideas of hell, and a lot of other literature that we kind of just like read back into the Bible and interpret things, I think, badly. And then there's also late scholarship. But if you look back at the early Jewish views of those kind of things, they're totally and completely different. The best modern guy on this is Michael Heiser. Have you read him at all?
I think I'd heard of him, and then whenever he was brought up in your video, I think I've heard of that book, but I haven't gotten to read it yet.
Yeah, if you get a chance, it's amazing. And I basically, my video that I just did is just outlining like kind of the intro to his.
And it's called Unseen Realms.
It's called Unseen Realm. Yeah. He's really well known on the internet now. I think his stuff has picked up a lot of traction recently. He's mostly just a gap bridger. He didn't invent any of this stuff. He's just bringing it back up. He's like, this stuff has been sitting in scholarship for years, and we've just been ignoring it because we don't like to talk about angels and demons in church. And we have this like crazy idea of it. But it's essentially just what I said, which is if you look for winged people fighting each other in heaven and getting cast out, you won't find that in the Bible. There's like one sequence, and it's in Revelation, which implies that it possibly takes place in the future, or possibly took place during the ministry of Jesus, which is when I think it took place, which is about like a battle of the angels in heaven. And so then you're like, okay, well, what were they doing during the entire Old Testament and the New Testament? And then you have to look into these passages. And then that also leads into what we call them angels, which comes from the New Testament, which is angelos, which is the Greek word. It means just messenger. And that's how they were referred to in the New Testament context, partially because that's how they translated the Old Testament into Greek. They use that word a lot more often. Whereas really in the Old Testament, they're referred to as the sons of God, or they're referred to as gods later on. And so these are like divine beings in heaven. We would call them angels. I usually just refer to them as angels. I don't mind that word, but it's just important to know that they're not just necessarily like dudes with wings, and they do a lot more than deliver messages. And so you have these angels who are with God in his divine place, which happens to be the same thing as the Garden of Eden. There's a whole lot that I go through in that video, but like to break it down simply, the serpent in the Genesis story is Satan. I think most people do know that from the identification that John makes in Revelation and a couple of other places where they point that out. But there's various passages about the Garden of Eden and the heavenly realms in Ezekiel and in Daniel and in Genesis that go over what actually happened. And it has a lot to do with the Tower of Babel event, and it has a lot to do with the Genesis 6 event with the sons of God and the Nephilim. And so you get this overall picture of like there is these beings, these divine beings who are around God and are in constant worship of God and engage in his plan, and then that one of them betrays him in the Garden of Eden, and that is Satan, who is the serpent, and then he gets cast out and punished and sent away from the divine realm. And then, but there's not a big war in heaven at that time. Like we just don't see, there's no evidence of that whatsoever. And then it seems like afterwards, there's two things that happen, which the first one is the flood, where there's sons of God called watchers. Some of this language comes from, I mean, it's reading the book of Daniel back on, but then there's also extracurricular literature like the book of Enoch. It's a really famous one that people like to
We all
bring
love the
up.
book of Enoch.
Yes, they like to bring it up all the time, and then you'll get accused of being a conspiracy nut. But there really is a lot of validity to it. First Enoch, which is a very small portion of the entire book of Enoch, actually existed before Christ. I believe there's 3 in the book of Enoch. Yes, there's first and second Enoch, and then it's called something else. But only first Enoch. I think it's the book of the Watchers and the book of something else. There's 2 parts to it, and those are the only ones that we consider historically valid. And there's even debate about that, but I think most scholarship agrees that they're before Christ. So these are like early Second Temple Jewish period texts, and they have a lot more information about the flood story, where they kind of just fill in the gaps. And so that's not even saying that it's like true, and it definitely shouldn't be scripture, but it's basically just saying like this offers us a view of what the Jews like 2,500 years ago were thinking about the Genesis story, and so maybe we should have that suggestion instead of like the John Milton one. Like, here's what these dudes thought way earlier on in this faith about like what these angels were and what they did. And so that gives us this picture of these angels who were in charge of watching over humanity, who found the women of humanity attractive and wanted to participate in sexual sin with them, and then descended and taught humanity to do all kinds of bad things. And then that's a big part of the reason why God floods the world in the Noah's Ark story. And if you're just reading Genesis, it feels like that's just slipped in there, which is sort of probably why they wrote the Book of Enoch. There's also a whole bunch of other literature that points to that. The Book of Enoch is just the most famous. I mean, that happens. After Noah, there's the Tower of Babel story. This is really the important part, because it gives you the idea of like what it actually means for God's people and how that supernatural worldview extends to today and extends to the cross, which is that the remaining sons of God who are loyal to God are put in charge of the other nations at the Tower of Babel event. So when he confuses everybody's languages because they're building a tower and trying to make themselves equal with him, he confuses everybody's languages, spreads them all over the world, and that's at what point he makes the nations, which become to refer to as the Gentiles. And so then you get the separation of Jews and Gentiles. And God says, I am over the Jews, and these other angels are going to rule over these other nations. And he splits them out. And you see that it's in Deuteronomy 32, it's in Psalm 82 and Psalm 89. There's a couple others, points where you see specific literature about this stuff. And so then you have this idea of those rival gods then kind of betray God and do whatever they want with those nations. So you see that with Sodom and Gomorrah, and with Egypt and the Exodus, and with the Promised Land, and all of these kind of places where God is then taking back these nations from these rival gods and like proving himself to be the true God through Israel.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So that would explain, because I know that a common thing in Old Testament kind of criticism is what was the reason for Israel conquesting around the area. Yeah. So it would be for that reason they're taking back from.
That's exactly right.
That makes sense.
And so, because God, the way I see it, I mean, this is expanding beyond the biblical text, but it's essentially God saying, like, how can I prove myself to all of humanity to be the one true God? And because he starts out with the knowledge that he's the one true God. Like, that's where it starts. We start with that in Eden, and we betray him once, and then we get into the Noah story, and everybody knows that there's one true God, but nobody cares, and they just do whatever they want, or they fall to these other rival angels. And so he gives us all these chances, and then at one point that's what he decides that he's going to use: a remnant, which is like the most recurring theme through all of the Bible, which is that God picks a small group of people to teach everybody else what the lesson is. And so he picks Abraham, and the descendants of Abraham become Israel. And so he says, this is my nation, and through them I shall influence the world. And so he becomes the ruler over this one nation, and he proves that all the other gods and all the other things that they worship are false. And that's how he sort of makes his name known throughout this space. And that's, yes, is the reason for the conquest and the recapturing of the area of Canaan that has become the Promised Land. and a whole bunch of other things. All the wars that you see through First and Second Kings have a lot to do with that, and even more than that, you see this in Paul's letters, and if you didn't know this, you'd be confused by these passages, where Paul says things like the principalities and powers are defeated by Christ when he rises from the dead. And so you're like, well, what does that mean? And so the important part is, there's a lot to it, but the important part is that Christ defeats their hold on the nations at his resurrection, because he makes it possible that not just the Jews can be saved, but that everybody can be covered in the blood of Christ. And so when he does that, he destroys the borders, essentially. And so these beings still exist and still have power, but they have no power over individual people because Christ has reclaimed them as his own. And so it is at that point where the nation of Israel is extended not just from Israel, but to all people everywhere. And that's sort of the message of the gospel, is like now God is in the process of reclaiming everybody from all the false gods and the demonic aspects of the world and things like that.
Yeah, it's like that. That reminds me of a verse from the beginning of Luke, I believe, from John the Baptist, and it's one of my favorite verses for that reason, where he says about, he's talking to the Pharisees, and he says, "You think you're the sons of Abraham? Our Father God can raise from these stones, sons of Abraham worthy for him." Yes. And it's like that's sort of like that's when this expansion is beginning, where through Christ, anyone can become a son of Abraham. It's no longer just the physical sons of Abraham. Yeah. That's really interesting. That kind of puts together a lot of things that I've been thinking about while I've been listening to people talk about this. Like, so this is sort of a theory that I've had that I think might make a lot more sense now from what you said. So you can tell me if I'm right or wrong. But so from that perspective of the lesser Elohims, the angels, let's say, being kind of given dominion over these specific parts of the world, kind of like what Paul was saying in Acts, where he talks about like each people being set in their own time and place. Yeah. So would that be a way that you could justify how other world religions, maybe let's say like the Greek and Roman mythologies and all those things, can actually be not legitimized in that they're true, but legitimized in that that's why those cultures were getting those stories, and they were getting them from, so like maybe let's say the principalities of ancient Greece would have been what these people interpreted as like Zeus and all that.
Yep, I think that's exactly right, and I have a video suggesting that as well. Okay. It's called "The Pagan Gods Are the Fallen Angels," and I hold that exact same belief.
And it makes a lot of sense because I started having this theory a long time ago. Whenever I was just like reading what Genesis was saying about the fallen angels, I mean, they're pretty much like just promiscuous people, and I mean that's like what you read in Greek mythology is they're coming down and wanting to intermingle. This was a thought I had recently, where in Greek mythology, sort of the pre-Greek pantheon Greek mythology was that there was these higher gods, which were the Titans, who sort of gave birth to the pantheon of Greek gods. And then because of, a battle that happened between them, well, a battle in the case of the Bible, a battle that happened between them, the Titans were kind of pushed away, and then the gods became the rulers of that area. That's really cool. That puts together a lot of different things in that regard.
Not only that, but you see commonalities through every world religion, especially pagan religious like systems, whether you're looking at like the Druidic, the Nordic, the Greek, the Egyptian, all of them point back to like super similar stories, and you see them develop. Zeus is a prime example of this. So you have a lightning and thunder god. It's obviously Zeus and Jupiter in Roman and Greek mythology. They share him. But then that's exactly how Baal is described in Canaanite mythology. He's a thunder and weather god, storm god, a Canaanite deity from the old-fashioned time. And so it just seems like the evolution. Baal is like the primary kind of son of God enemy. In the Bible, you hear more about him than any of the other gods of other nations.
He's the closest one to where Israel is.
Yeah, and to me, it just seems to suggest Lucifer in many ways to me. Like that is the satanic. He makes himself the head of all these pantheons and says like, I'm the top Canaanite god and I'm the top Greek god. I don't know that for certain, but like there's those commonalities. There's commonalities in the stories. I think it's super important to note that like almost all cultures, not necessarily religions, have a common story right before the Babel myth. So if you look back, most have a creation myth that takes a really similar sequence to extracting order out of chaos, or some kind of like defeat of the gods and then the birth of the world from the death of the gods. Something along those lines is like really similar. And then you have a flood myth by Native American and Icelandic groups all over the world, a flood myth. And that's because the flood is the last thing that happens before they're scattered. And so that would be the last common myth that all nations would have in common. Because at the Babel event, I think they're supernaturally scattered. That's debated. Some people are just like, maybe he just makes them move. But I think they're supernaturally scattered all over the world. And so the last thing that they're left with is these remnants of what we see in early Genesis, which is the common, and then everything else from there is kind of made up and based on these myths of gods and monsters that they have, and it just proceeds out from that.
Yeah, we have that common sort of bedrock, and then everything after that, it's like it can have sort of shards and remnants of that truth because it's still sprouting from the same tree.
Exactly.
But yeah, okay. Well, that's really cool that I've wanted to talk about this with someone. So that's cool that we could talk about this. But
yeah.
So you had brought up in the Eden story how you interpret Satan's fall as being then in Genesis at that fall, which does make a lot of sense then because that's whenever God curses him and then creates that prophecy about the seed of Eve crushing his heel, which would be Christ.
Which everybody interprets as a messianic prophecy. Well, not everybody, but most people recognize that as a messianic prophecy regarding what Jesus is going to do to Satan. And I just think it would have been maybe a revelation at the time. There was debate about this in like Jewish scholarship, but I think for the most part they recognized that it was a divine being, some kind of angel. And then the Satan idea, which you see a lot more of in the New Testament, where they really kind of zero in on him specifically, and then that culminates in the book of Revelation, where John says, finally, at the end of time, Jesus will cast that great devil, that ancient serpent who is Satan, and throw him into the eternal fire. Like I see that as sort of like John is saying, like, this is him. This is the guy. He's been here all along. He's going to get thrown out down at the end.
And it would be a perfect ending then, because it's like it ends exactly where it starts.
It ends exactly where it starts.
So you had brought up about how you interpret that war in heaven was happening while Jesus was alive. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so that one is a little bit more specific. I think it's Revelation 12 that talks about the battle in heaven between the angels. It's either Revelation 12 or Revelation 20, where it talks about that. And it says that Satan went into heaven and there was a war and a third of the angels fell. And then when Satan fell, he pursues the child of the virgin. And that all takes place in this Revelation context. And so, like, the dispensational approach is that that's future. So there's, like, some kind of future heavenly war that's going to occur, and then Satan will pursue, like, a remnant or something like that. What I think is a better view is that is at the time of Jesus. And essentially that there's texts that point to this. I'm not going to be able to remember them all off the top of my head. But one of them is that when Jesus first sanctifies and sends out his apostles into ministry, I think it's Luke 6 or Luke 8, he says, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. He says it right at that time, and it's kind of random. And it's when he's sending the apostles out to minister to the nations. And I think that implies that either at that point in time or when he dies and is resurrected is essentially like, this is the part where we're reclaiming the world. And this is the part where Satan has lost access because of what I've accomplished. Like, I see that as that's when Satan loses his access to heaven. I think that he has access to heaven before that. You see that in the Job passage. If we assume that the figure in Job is Satan, like the same Satan, there's some debate about that as well. But if you assume that that's Satan, that he kind of has the ability to go into heaven and taunt God and try things and things like that. And so he's defeated, but he's not kicked out of the heavenly realm completely until the time of Jesus. And so based on that, like, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. And then if you look at Revelation, I think it's 12, what the context is for that passage is, I think, a history of Christianity. Like, it gives, like, here was my people, and then there was a woman, and the woman conceived and was with child, and then there was war in heaven, and then they went down to earth, and then Satan pursued the child into the wilderness. I think the child in that passage, and this is not my interpretation, it's a common interpretation, that child is the church. And so the idea is that like, this is the consummation of Christianity. This is the beginning of Christianity. And when Christianity begins and when the nations begin to be retaken, that's when Satan is kicked out of heaven. And now he's pursuing us on earth. We fight back against him with the Holy Spirit. And eventually we usher in the kingdom of God. That's the way that I interpret that passage. I'd have to pull up the scripture and go through it. But there's details in that passage that I think suggest...
Actually, while we're here, do you want to look through?
I can pull it up on my phone too. Yeah, but I think there's details that are in there that really suggest that. Okay, so this is Revelation 12, and it's sort of separate from Revelation 11. It just sort of goes back to this. This is what John's seeing in heaven, because he's taken up to heaven and he's given signs. He says, "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. That's Israel. 12 representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Probably. That's how I interpret it. There's other, everything that I say is debatable. When you get into Revelation, everything that you read is debatable.
Could you also see it as maybe the 12 disciples, though?
It could be the 12 disciples, potentially. I think based on the next part, that it's probably Israel. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them down to earth." So that's the famous verse where you get the idea that Satan and a third of the angels rebelled and then were cast down to hell. That's the traditional idea that you get, and that's what John Milton portrays, which is this battle at the beginning of time, and then they're cast down.
Yeah, and he puts it at the beginning of time, whereas
yes,
this is... Okay.
It's possible it could be at the beginning of time. There's just not a single other scriptural passage that suggests that. This is the only one that suggests that. And cast them down to earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child. Sorry, the male child is actually Jesus in this, not the church. But then the woman is the church. It sort of gets specific because, like I said, the idea that I told you before, which is that Israel is then extended and becomes the Christian church. So, Israel just means God's chosen people, and so they are extended. So Israel gives birth to a male child, verse 5, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. That's Jesus. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. That's Christ's ascension. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. That could mean a whole bunch of things. But it's essentially the idea of the church. So the Israel gives birth to Jesus. Jesus ascends up because Jesus comes from the tribes of Israel. Then you have what's left, and then Satan pursues them on earth after he's been kicked down. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world, was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, "Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God." To me, that's clear cut. The Christ has come, therefore the accuser has been thrown down. That's what it says. And so to me, it's like Satan no longer has a place in heaven because Jesus came and did what he did. So Jesus' action results in Satan and the evil angels being kicked out of the divine realm and subject to earth in some way, shape, or form.
And that would make a lot of sense too, because Satan's actions in Jesus' life make it seem very much like he's worried about losing what he currently has, which would be dominion over the earth. Because the temptation in the wilderness is sort of that last-ditch effort of I'll give you what you are doing, what you're going to do by dying on the cross, and I'll just give it to you so then you don't have to do this, resurrection and all this stuff and, obtain the mercy seat. Yeah. And so it's like, in that respect, it's like Satan's kind of the scared little kid who's trying to, do his last-ditch effort to.
And when they killed him on the cross, Paul tells us that they thought they got him. They thought they won. Yeah. That all the sons of darkness shouted for joy when that happened. Because they thought they had killed the Messiah who was going to come. They thought Jesus was going to come and take the earth back from them. Because Satan was the ruler of the world, and to some extent still is. Satan is the ruler, the prince of the power of the air. And so they thought that Jesus was going to come and get them, but they were wrong because they didn't realize that Jesus would defeat the grave, because they didn't realize that Jesus was God, or something along those lines. Okay. I think there's an extent to it, but essentially, they know that he's the Messiah, but they have the same misunderstanding that the Pharisees do, which is that he's...
So you're saying that the other fallen angels had that same misunderstanding?
I think so. I forget what the verse is. I think it's Colossians 2, maybe, but there's a verse where Paul says that the principalities and powers crucified them, and they would not have done this if they knew what was going to happen, basically.
Yeah, because why would you do the thing that's basically exactly...
So they thought they were defeating Jesus by killing him. They, whispered, and it says that Satan entered the heart of Judas. Yeah. That the point is, it fulfills prophecy, but it's Satan's work. It's it's not God's work to have Judas betray Jesus and do all these evil things. That's still an evil thing, and it's done by the evildoer. And so Satan's idea is let's kill this Messiah, let's have his own people turn on him and get rid of him. They didn't anticipate either what Jesus was or what Jesus was going to do, which is that because he was sinless, death had no claim on him, and so therefore he conquered death. And when he conquered it, it broke the veil for all people. And so anybody who's in Christ has now also defeated death. and so they lose.
And Satan really dropped the ball on that one.
Yeah, yeah, you could say that.
That's so cool. I like that, man. Like that's what I love. Like you said this earlier, but that's what I love about digging deeper and deeper into this. It's like just whole new worlds basically are being revealed. I mean, it's like in like a sci-fi movie when you shrink down and shrink down and shrink down, and it's like you just keep discovering new worlds like all the way down. That's insane.
Yeah, the depth of Scripture is unbelievable. It's the greatest story ever told, and there's so many reasons for that.
So, I mean, now that we're talking about this part about Satan and the fallen angels, actually, wait, before we move on to the next thing, I did want to ask to clarify. So, do you think then that the third of the angels who chose to follow Satan chose to follow him because they thought that Satan knew what he was talking about whenever he said that like Jesus isn't actually who he says he is?
It's hard to tell. I don't actually know what the reason is.
Yeah.
They might have been the third that were already like had betrayed God. I don't know. It might just be a figurative number. It might not be a literal third. It says that his tail swept a third of the stars from heaven, and then in the second part it says that there was no longer any place found for them in heaven. So I'm gonna guess that it might include the ones from the Babel event and the ones from the Nephilim. Well, actually not the Watchers, because the Watchers are probably already in hell. That's sort of a different story. It says in the book of Enoch that after the Watchers committed their sin in Genesis 6 that they were actually like chained in the underworld, and then Revelation tells us that they'll be released during the end times to cause havoc on earth, basically. That's a whole different subject. But anyways, it seems to me like it might be the false rulers of the other nations. So the gods who are put in charge of things at the Tower of Babel event, I think are probably, part of this 1/3, whether that's a completely accurate number or a figurative number, of these angels who are already disloyal to God and are just become the peers of Satan. Satan is the influencer of them all because he's the original one who had this idea of like, we don't have to do, we don't have to sit, we can make ourselves gods. We want to have something in our own image. And so that's how I see it. It could very well be that they decided to betray him just then because they were mad about Jesus or something like that. It's really hard to say, for sure.
Well, then maybe, because I know in your video about this, you had talked about how when God was talking and he said, let us make man in our image, that, I mean, there's people, and I hold the interpretation that he would have been speaking to the Trinity nature of God, but then there's also, you had said about he could have been speaking to all the other Elohims, meaning the angels. Do you think that then might have been, I mean, obviously none of this can be proved because it would all just be interpretation, but that might have been kind of the impetus seed for Satan thinking maybe we could do this then, like we can do things in our own image, and that was whenever he was, for the first time, twisted what was done good through God into something evil, and then that led to him being the deceiver then of Eve.
Yeah, I think it's definitely possible. I mean, that passage is complicated. I think the Trinity view is a possible view. Michael Heiser, who I mentioned, is against that view very heavily, and so that's why I mentioned it in the video, because I was kind of going over his work. I'm not 100% sure whether I agree or disagree. I do think it's probably most likely that he was talking to the Council of Angels in that passage, because I don't think that you see the idea of the Trinity. I think I see the Trinity as kind of like this surprise thing that God like reveals slowly over time, personally.
Which makes sense.
But I do think,
because it talks about in one of Paul's letters, I think it's Galatians, about it being the secret plan that God basically like revealed.
Yeah, well, that's why I said my personal view right now, and I stand to have this corrected. These are, again, with things that I'm just learning. Like, I'm more solid on most of the stuff I've said, but some things I'm still speculating about. And that's my speculation, is that Jesus didn't know, or Satan didn't know that Jesus was God. That's my speculation, and that's part of why God was keeping it a secret and like told it to the Pharisees in some suggestive language or something like that. But like, they didn't realize the full extent to which, like, if they killed him, he would just rise from the dead because he's God. Like, something about that they didn't get, or that they didn't realize he was sinless, or I'm not quite sure. I don't have it fully figmented, but that's part of how I see it, is the Trinity is sort of this surprise, like, gotcha, Satan, like, I came to earth, and also the Holy Spirit dwells within my believers, so you can't possess them. Like kind of this whole like trap that God springs upon Satan in many ways. I think it's suggested. There's other academic literature. There's a book that's really popular right now. It's really scholarly, but it's called The Two Powers in Heaven.
I've heard of that one too.
And it's a big influence on Heiser as well, but it kind of goes over this idea, which is that like Jewish scholars back in the day saw these prophetic passages in the Old Testament that referred to God in like two people, and they're like, what does that mean? How is there another person in heaven who has the same roles as God? And like we don't understand that until we get Jesus. this, and like then we're like, oh, that's the second person they were talking about all those times. And so that's sort of a separate topic. But in either extent, I think it could have been a great many things that influenced Satan to try and make something in his own image. I think all it tells us was that he had just like a spirit of pride or something. I mean, the sin of pride is always associated with Satan. The most information that we get about it is in Ezekiel 28. Is the famous passage where if you really want to see it, it's like the most definitive passage where it tells us about Satan's fall. He's rebuking the king of Tyre and giving a prophecy to Ezekiel, but he then goes back and uses this language about the king of Tyre's fall that refers to a being that was in Eden, and it's just so clearly, I go over it in the video, but you were the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering, and crafted in gold were your settings. On the day that you were created, they were prepared. You were an anointed guardian cherub. Cherub is the angels that Ezekiel sees. These are the famous, like, people always talk about, like, biblically accurate angels on the internet, and they have, like, the 4 faces and the rings. Those are cherubim. You were an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created until unrighteousness was found in you. In the abundance of your trade, you were filled with violence in your midst, and you sinned. So I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, and I destroyed you from the midst of the stones of fire. Your heart was proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. I cast you to the ground, and I exposed you before kings. So that's all it really tells us about Satan's motivations. He was proud, he was corrupted, and he committed violence and sin against the world. That's pretty much all the information we get. So.
And that's interesting, too, that they brought up. I didn't take note of that the first time when I was watching your video, that they brought up in Ezekiel about his covering being the precious stones and that sort of thing. Because in Genesis, it sort of has that random mention of like how to the east and to the west, there were all these different precious stones like lapis lazuli and gold and emerald and all this. And it doesn't make sense because they never explain it. But that might be a way to reckon that with Ezekiel.
Yeah, I think they use the stones very similarly. It's like when you see like stars, that's almost always referring to divine beings or angels in the Bible. So you'll see lots of mentions, like we showed the Revelation passage. Sometimes it also refers to believers, and sometimes it also refers to Israel. But most of the time in the Old Testament, it refers to like divine encounters or something. So he'll refer to them as stars or shining ones or things like that. The famous passage from which we get the word Lucifer is the passage in Isaiah 14 where it says, "Oh, shining one, the son of the morning dawn," which is, we think, a reference to the planet Venus, the morning star, which is where we get the idea of like Lucifer, morning star. Shining one in Latin is Lucifer. That's where that comes from. And so there's this idea associated with the divine of like shining and precious and like these colors. And then you have like the rainbow, I think, is heavily suggested too. Like in John's depiction of the Revelation throne room scene, you get that idea of the rainbow. He talks about like all these colors. And then in the Ezekiel and Daniel throne room scenes where they see the throne room of God, they also use those jewels. It's like lapis lazuli, which is like blue, I think it's the same thing as like a sapphire. And that's the description of God's throne. And then there's like emerald, and there's like all these other stones. And I think that they use that to like, it's just like a depiction of divine imagery, because like that's like the most like valuable kind of shiny, bright thing that we can think of on earth. And so I think when you see anything that's like shining, the other depiction we get of heavenly beings in like all through Ezekiel and Daniel and Revelation is this like glowing amber, like they're on fire essentially. Like it says, I think it's like glowing like amber, or glowing like hot burning metal, or inflamed metal. It can mean like all of those things, and that's the other depiction we get of like these divine. So this idea of like glowing, precious, vibrant kind of is associated with divine imagery. That's the way that I see it, and so I think that the jewels and the diamonds have a lot to do with that, but I don't know for certain.
Yeah, and I mean, some of these things we won't know for certain until the other side of eternity.
Yeah.
So, and that's kind of the exciting thing about talking about a lot of this, is it's like we can speculate a lot and it'll always have answers, but we'll never know all the answers until we keep going.
We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Through the unknown remembered gate,